People who lived under communism, what was it like? My own repost. We had relatives from Hungary in the late 80s that somehow got permission to visit us in the US. My dad was like, "Oh, we're going to stop at a supermarket to pick some stuff up and you guys can pick out what you like." We walked into a non-huge Grand Union, they almost flipped their shit. They accused my dad of taking them to a fake tourist supermarket where you would bring people to show off. We ended up driving to 5 different supermarkets and they obviously all looked the same. My relatives were completely dumbfounded, I mean like awe-struck. I remember them looking at the salad dressing aisle like they were seeing Jesus. We ended up buying multiple bags of chips, salad dressing, sodas and ice cream. Every morning they would ask my parents if we could go walk around a different supermarket before we did the activity for the day. I think my cousin ate like 40 pounds of cheese balls before he left. Edit. Another tidbit: one of the other big things they really liked was our shitty chest freezer. They kept asking what we do when the power goes out. I was always like, "What are you talking about? Well, do you have to eat everything at once?" "No, you misunderstand, the power doesn't go out here. Ever. Have a creamsile." The ability to produce multiple flavors of frozen confections on demand really impressed them. Also, I caught my cousin grabbing ice pop after ice pop and fudge shield, which kinda pissed me off. But my mother said let him eat as much as he wants. She would secretly restock it so he didn't feel bad. Which in hindsight was pretty cool of her. I had an employee from Poland in the 80s. Then it was before the Poles had their revolution and replacement of the communist government. He was a fireman over there. So I asked, was he a hose guy or what? Nope. His job was to run into the building and try to save the furniture. And after the fire, his job was removing all the metal objects from the ruin. Nails, hinges, whatever. Because material shortages were endemic. Furniture, clothing, appliances, tools and hardware for homeowners or renters do-it-yourself projects were scarce. Not me, but my parents and grandparents all lived under communism. My parents were born and raised under communism, and they both said their childhoods were great. They have hundreds of stories of them playing in the streets, and for the most part they had a very normal childhood. My mom said that in school for the most part they learned history but through the lens of the Soviet Union. Lenin was treated like a god and Soviet history was the first and foremost thing they were taught growing up. She also talked about how when they were kids, they would always show clips of the civil rights riots in the 60s as if to let them know how badly the US treats their citizens. My grandparents immigrated to the Soviet Union in their 20s, so their experience was much more negative. Work and basic necessities were hard to come by. Bribery was a common way of getting by. Talking in code was also normal, and they also had to be very careful about what they said in front of their own children. My mom at a young age was basically brainwashed to believe communism was amazing and Lenin was great, and any criticism my grandparents would have, they would have to keep it to themselves. My grandmother passed away years ago, but to her dying days she had nothing but negative things to say about the Soviet Union. My mom and dad basically said childhood was amazing in the Soviet Union, but they were both glad they left when they did. Edit. I will also add that my parents both had positive things to say about Soviet art, movies, culture, etc. They also liked the Russian patriotic songs, which my mom can still sing if someone plays it in front of her. But my parents are both proud Americans now. I was born in Kiev, now Kiev, Ukraine, and moved to the US in 1998. I actually don't recall too many details of my early childhood. I also don't remember my family relocating to Leningrad for a few months in 1986, considering how close Kiev was to Chernobyl. I just remember my parents trying to explain to me that we were no longer living in the USSR, it was now CIS. But my grandparents generally had good things to say, even cursing out Gorbachev for destroying a great nation. Although my dad, Jewish, told me that he wanted to go to med school but ended up going to a railroad university because that's one of the few places that would take Jews. Yeah, there was a lot of anti-Semitism there. Not sure if it was all of the USSR or just Ukraine, which has a long history of hating Jews. Cossacks used to conduct frequent pogroms. Then again, these days my parents are firmly capitalist, which is why they dislike Bernie. Both of my parents did. Everyone had to work hard to make money and grow food on their farms. Things like music and movies from Western culture were banned, even though my dad listened to ABBA when he was a kid somehow. All schools required everyone to learn Russian. I don't know if this was communist rules or just my dad's country, but if a mother gave birth to at least 5 kids, she was allowed to retire 2 years early. On a side note, my great-grandpa on my mom's side was taken by Stalin, presumably to one of the camps, and was never seen or heard from again. Family did, and with a socialist communist party leader. As far as they were concerned, the leader was relatively decent and actually internationally beloved. They certainly didn't want to serve the Communist Party, but there seemed to be good things that came out of his rule. He created tourism, go figure, and promoted Western interactions which only improved our relations. They never felt or spoke of a sense of oppression or total control. My partner's family was dead set against this same socialist communist leader and were told and knew of, by an opposing party representatives, that this socialist communist leader was trying to destroy religion, freedoms, etc. Neither of us knew anyone who were fundamentally harmed during that time. It's interesting to be in a relationship where each of us grew up, knowing such polarities as fact from the same place. My story reads as a guess. The communist had a coworker who lived in East Germany. She told me she hated how she was told to dress, keep her hair cut short, and people watching her all the time. And then she shook her head and walked away. I worked with 2 brothers that immigrated from Cuba to Spain, then Canada, then USA. Both had served in military. Education is very good, medical is very good, but food is scarce. Everyone tells on everyone else, limited water and power. Everyone has a side hustle to make money or something to barter. Buildings have a water tower for gravity feed and you pump when you have power. Battery power as the backup. And X200B. It has gotten better in last 10 to 15 years, but still tough. They did talk about eating canned horse meat, and said it was good. Pigs and chicken and fish were main protein sources. One picture from my childhood. We are a group of 5-year-olds in the kindergarten. The teacher asks children, "Who is Lenin?" And we have to repeat all together the formula, the leader of the workers and the peasants. We hear propaganda stories about the glorious communist revolution. It was about the same age that I have first tried ketchup on potatoes. It was a deficit back then. I remember my mashed potatoes suddenly got 10 times better. We could have bananas and oranges about once a year, around Christmas time. Books were the biggest treasure. Our family had quite an impressive library. Not me, but my parents did. There were huge lines for food every week. The TV only had 2 channels, and even then they were only available for some 2 to 3 hours per day. If you had a car, you either worked for the government or knew someone who did. It genuinely angers me to see young kids from the West who support it and think that communism equals no work and everyone is happy. No, it's not even close. My mother grew up at the peak of the Russian takeover of Poland from the 1949 to 1989, and she said it was the worst thing ever. From a young age she was taught Russian along with Polish, and had a very uniform schedule. She went to a Catholic school rather than a state school, so I don't know how education was affected. They barely made enough a week to get food, and the lines for the shops were tremendously long. If they ran out, it didn't matter how desperate or how long you stood in line, that was it for either the day or the entire week. You couldn't feel safe anywhere, not even your own home, because anyone could rat you out for anything, and that would lead to a home invasion without notice. If they damaged something in your home, that was that. Nothing you can say or do because you were insignificant. Military and tanks patrolled the streets every day and night. Curfews were instilled at any time they wanted, and if you were caught out you were either beat up or jailed or fined ridiculous amounts of money they couldn't make soon enough. Medical and living conditions were awful, and many of the damaged buildings after World War II weren't renovated or fixed properly until after 1989. Medical technologies were hardly updated, making most hospitals unreliable if a fatal injury occurred. Overall, from what she said, it was horrible. People joke about wanting to re-establish communism, when they don't know or understand the truth of what communism does to a state's economy and people. Former world chess champion Garry Kasparov talks about it all the time. He is incredibly brilliant and definitely worth a follow on Twitter. https://twitter.com/Kasparov63 $S = 21 Since he grew up under communist rule, He has particularly good insights into Vladimir Putin and Russia. I remember we didn't have chocolate candy in my hometown, so my mother brought some from her trip to Moscow. They were made in my hometown. My grandparents lived through communist China. Grandpa worked as a technician in a brick-making factory and Grandma was a stay-at-home mom with 3 kids. They had a better life than most because the job took a little skill and it wasn't all hard labor. Side jobs earned quite a bit of money. Everyone grew a garden and grew high-yield vegetables. If you could knit a wool sweater, you can almost trade it for a month's worth of wages. They did pretty well. Considering my grandpa died early due to heart problems and my grandma still afforded my dad to go to university, which he was the 4th generation of graduates from China as it came out of communism. My mom grew up in communist Romania. She was a Christian, which wasn't allowed, so she had to be super careful all the time. She had to keep her Bible in a secret spot just in case the police came to do a random check. Basically, she couldn't trust anyone. The thing is, though, that she didn't really have any idea that she grew up under communism. She just thought that that was the way things were. I actually remember learning about communism when I was in middle school and asking her what it was like for her growing up. She thought that I had made a mistake until I showed her that the years she lived there and the years communism was active there matched up. She went and did a bunch of research and admitted that she had no idea how messed up her country was. Pretty crazy. Go find the recent video of the dude from Cuba breaking down in tears just walking though in Aldi. I didn't, but both my parents did under vastly different circumstances. My dad grew up very poor under Ceausescu in communist Romania and had a horrible childhood. Once he was arrested for listening to Bob Dylan with his friends. My mum grew up under Tito in Yugoslavia, but her grandparents were very high up in the partisan party and they had a great life. Edit. For more detail, my dad and his parents hated Ceausescu with all their might. They were cheering on his execution. My mum and her parents were treating Tito like a god, and she told me that when he died she asked her parents, "What will the world be like now?" From childhood memory. It was great for kids but bad for adults. We had less things and the stores were often empty, but we had enough to live. We spent our whole time playing outside or reading books. We used our imagination a lot. The Iron Curtain didn't feel like a prison, more like an impossible frontier. And beyond it, so many foreign countries to dream about. We knew the whole propaganda was probably a lie. It was a fun game to listen to adults and try to find out what they really meant. For adults, it was the constant struggle to make ends meet, while living in a hypocritical system where free thought was a crime and you could trust none. The constant grinding of the soul was the worst. Then, we started to hear about people disappearing, some of them later found dead. I remember asking my mother, "Am I allowed to write in my diary that I'm afraid?" Well, one of the guys I work with was from communist Romania. Lots of waiting in line, and oftentimes by the time he got to the front the store was already out of food. They also got a discount voucher for meat twice a year, once for Christmas and once for some communist holiday, mostly bones. Mandatory military service where you'd have to go to towns and ask villagers for spare food or hunt your own. He is not a fan of communism. Czech Republic. My parents grew up in it. They constantly tell stories about it. There was a huge element of bribery in every facet of the economy. You wanted anything done? Better have something to trade. The population was split into 2 camps, communists and normal people. If you wanted to graduate college, you had to enter the Communist Party. Did you want a good job? Better enter the Communist Party. Snitching was a huge part of social dynamics. My mom was discriminated against in her school, for example, because their parents didn't subscribe to some communist newspaper. There was basically only 1 or 2 products in any given category available for purchase. 1 or 2 kinds of t-shirt, or pants, or sport shoes. 1 or 2 types of kitchen appliances, or biscuits or cars. There was no variety. Everyone basically got the same stuff. My dad was allowed to travel to the West as a part of his college work program. He said it was like traveling 100 years into the future. What especially amazed him were the shops. Whereas at home they sold meat in non-refrigerated shelves wrapped in old newspapers, when it's actually available. Out there were hundreds of types of meat wrapped in futuristic plastic. It was like being in another world. Apparently, my dad bought a frozen pizza. didn't know how to prepare it because he had no idea what it was. So he just ate it as it was. My dad also earned more than a month's pay by picking up glass bottles and returning them back to a shop. The kind when you get a tiny amount back for each bottle, in one night. The most comprehensive look into how the society worked under communism you can see in North Korea or Cuba. My ex-wife grew up in Armenia. I asked her and her mom on a few occasions. Some interesting things they told me were how the only real way to be successful was to do shady and immoral things. One person in particular would steal things from the factory he was a supervisor at so he could turn around and sell them for money or trade for other things like food, etc. My ex-wife grandma, who's just not very nice in general, was a college professor and she'd take bribes from students for their grades. My ex-Mill talked about how no matter what you did there was no hope for success of any kind. There was always a ceiling on what you could accomplish. My ex, who was born in '86 and barely remembered times before the Soviet Union fell, talked about how the country was like living in District 12 from the Ginger Games. This was my analogy for what she was describing. She lived in the capital city, Yerevan, and there was power maybe an hour a day. People would run one single light in their apartment that many people would share with their entire families with a car battery. One of the only things that did have power was the streetcar, but ironically nobody could afford to ride it, so what she remembered about that is the streetcar tracks were the only areas cleared of snow in the wintertime, so that's where everyone would walk around the city. During that time, the only natural resource the tiny country had for meat was fish from the large lake, so naturally that lake was massively overfished and is very underpopulated now. Friend of mine is from communist Hungary. Said his father was an architect and was told to build an apartment building at a particular site. His pops didn't like the site though. The ground wasn't right for a building that tall. Doesn't matter, build it or face jail time. So, he builds it best he can. A few years later, heavy rain causes a mudslide and part of the building collapse. Multiple people die. Pops is now likely going to be executed. Never got the escape details, but within days his family was in Austria and on their way to the US. Otherwise, he said, mandatory military at 18 was a bunch of kids getting drunk on mouthwash and knifing each other. And every once in a while he could go to a concert, but it almost always ended with fire hoses on the crowds. Thanks for watching. See you later.